Hi, everybody. This is going to be a very short lecture video. I did post to you the other day the material that you're going to be watching this week for the beginning of learning financials. But I just wanted to kind of review the case studies in third-party insurance. And so hopefully, as you watch that video, you have a better understanding of the relationship of what a PBM is, how PPMs actually control the formularies, and anything else other than that. One of the things we probably will, maybe not this semester, but next semester, go into a little bit detail about third-party contracting. And if you do have a desire interest in that, please shoot me an email. But what I want to talk about is the various tools that we deal with every day from PBMs on how they control formularies. And so this exercise that I've had for a couple years is based on real life experiences that we see in the community pharmacy every day, and how do we impact them, not only using our thinking, we always have to think about our business skills, but we actually by applying our clinical skills. And so these every one of these cases did not have a direct answer because there was always some more information you needed to know. But let's take a look at them. And like I said, we're going to go through them fairly quickly here, but it gives you a good idea of what would you do. And if you have any other questions of, well, that's not exactly how I did it, shoot me an email and we can always discuss that. So case study one, we have a 55-year-old female patient comes to the pharmacy for a new prescription of generic Crestor, 10 milligrams. When you go to fill the prescription, you notice her copay is $52. The copay alarms the patient. You find out this is a Tier 3 drug on her commercial Highmark plan. So if you remember from the third-party insurance lecture, I talked about how there's various different tiers. And one of the things is usually a plan is either a 4-tier or a 5-tier plan. And usually the first tier is like the cheapest generics. Second tier is either the more expensive generics if it's a 5-tier plan, or the second tier is preferred brands. And what a lot of times insurances do now is they don't necessarily decide to say that, not every drug is a prior auth drug, but sometimes what they do is they look at whether or not maybe this drug's not worth prior authoring. What we'll do is we'll put it into the third tier. And they do that sometimes with generics. So for example, generic Crestor, rovastatin, when it first came out, one of the things that happens with generic drugs a lot of times when they first come out, there's usually about a 6-month exclusivity where only one company makes the product. And sometimes based on popularity of the product, based upon contracts the PBMs may still have with brands, sometimes the cost of the generic doesn't go down in price right away. And so one of the things we've dealt with in the last year or two here is that Crestor, even though it's generic, is still fairly expensive and is not always in the first or second tier of a plan. So one of the things that I might ask this patient is, have they tried other statins in the past? And so obviously 2 other good statins that are generic that are fairly cheap is simvastatin and atorvastatin. Well, you also know from your cardiovascular classes that patients who need moderate to high intensity, simvastatin, atorvastatin, or rovastatin are their 3 main choices. We also might ask them if they had been on simvastatin or atorvastatin, what happened. And sometimes there is, possibilities that rovastatin is more tolerated because it's more hydrophilic and it's absorbed, it's metabolized different than simvastatin and atorvastatin. The other thing too is this is a 55-year-old patient. Obviously, they don't make coupon cards for generic Crestor. However, if you ran out of options, that they had a possible myopathy or rhabdomyolysis to atorvastatin and simvastatin, if they were high risk, then we may need to explain to them the benefits of the Crestor. If they're not a high risk patient, but the physician still thinks they need statin medication, although this doesn't always follow the clinical guidelines, another cheaper one they may want to try initially is pravastatin, and that would kind of be my last option. So, identifying why this drug is a tier, what are those other clinical options, we can find that win-win for the patient. Case study number 2, a patient comes to the pharmacy, has a prescription for a 90-day supply, and this actually should have said generic Celebrex. When you go to fill the prescription, it's rejected for a notice that it's step therapy tier 3 with a quantity limit of 30 days. One of the things that happens with a lot of insurance is if it's a highly still expensive drug, and even though Celebrex is generic, it does have, it's not as cheap as other generics, is that sometimes they will, even though the patient can get 90 days, they'll limit certain expensive drugs only to 30 days due to that they don't want to pay for them and they worry about waste. So what we would have to do in this scenario is talk to the patient again. We know Celebrex is a COX-2 inhibitor type of NSAID, so it decreases the incidence of GI bleed. So one of the things we may want to talk to the patient, see if they've had a history of GI bleed, if they, currently had a GI bleed, maybe using other NSAIDs. If they're a high-risk patient, high-risk patients may be patients above the age of 65, and also on other drugs that increase the risk for GI ulcers, such as being on long-term steroids, such as prednisone. And so then we may need to assess that. One of the things, if the patient can't afford this medication, even if, that we go to fill with a 30-day, it comes back with a high copay, just like the Crestor above, that we may want to assess whether or not the patient may qualify for another option. So that we may be able to switch them to an NSAID like meloxicam. And NSAIDs that are not COX-2 inhibitive, there is the clinical scenario that if you put them on a PPI, such as omeprazole, that decreases the risk. And I know that there's long-term risk with PPIs also, but if this is only for a short-term treatment, such as maybe post-hip or knee, maybe this would be a good option for them. So once again, this is finding out that scenario and finding that win. And once again, this is an example of understanding those tier 3s. One of the things that, if something falls into a tier 3 and if they're not a Medicare D patient and it's a brand drug, another option that we can do often sometimes is that those drug coupon cards, and those drug coupon cards are usually are available online. A lot of times the patient has to register for it. You can actually search, if you have access to the internet at your pharmacy and talk to the patient. And a lot of times what those drug coupons will do, they'll knock that down to a second-tier copay and the patient can afford it. The only caution that I tell you that you need to warn the patient that these coupons are only good for 6 months to a year, so that they really got to assess, do they get a great benefit from this drug, because eventually they still may be paying that tier 3 pricing. There are ways that it's not always successful, but there are ways that patients can have their physicians challenge the health plan, that there's a cost issue, they need this drug, and sometimes they can win an appeal to knock a tier 3 drug down to tier 2. It's not always easy, but it can be there. Case study number 3, we have a Medicare D patient. And this Medicare D patient is an 81-year-old patient, comes to the pharmacy with a new prescription for Uloric, and Uloric is used for gout. It is a xanthine oxidase inhibitor, and another generic cheap one on the market that's very similar to it is allopurinol. One of the things that I put in this case scenario is sometimes clinically we need to also think about, okay, what other drugs are on? Because what other drugs are on might tell you disease states and might tell you the reasoning why the physician wanted to go with this drug. Calcium acetate is a phosphate binder, and calcium acetate is usually associated with patients that have renal disease. Uloric, which is a fairly more expensive product than allopurinol as a xanthine oxidase inhibitor, its marketing ploy is that you don't have to worry as much renally as you do with allopurinol. But the one thing with allopurinol, though, is you can really dose adjust this. And so maybe talking to the patient, have they been on allopurinol before? Has the physician tried to renally dose it? That they may get a win-win of using a generic versus a brand. Because a lot of times, too, Uloric is rejected due to the theory of step therapy. And step therapy is another way to alleviate prior authorizations. And so one of the things, if it came back as a rejection to step therapy, that means that the physician or the patient has never tried allopurinol before. Because if the patient had tried allopurinol before and failed it, say they got a prescription for it, and 30 days later they get a prescription for Uloric, what happens in step therapy, you usually don't need a prior auth, it'll automatically be covered. Now, just because it's automatically covered doesn't mean the patient can afford it. Uloric may be a step therapy drug, but it could fall into a tier 2, but it could fall into a tier 3. The downside of Medicare D patients is that they can't use the drug coupons. And the reason why they can't use the drug coupons is there's a law called Medicare Medicaid Kickback Law. And under Medicare Medicaid Kickback Law, a lot of times, they feel that, that under the Medicare D kickback law, they feel that the coupons are an enticement to get patients to use one product over the other, even though we know that this also could be a financial benefit to help the patient. There are assistance programs that the physician and the patient could research that sometimes are offered for Medicare D patients. It's just not an easy solving fix as a drug coupon. But once again, in this case scenario, we would want to see if they could try allopurinol first before they go to the more expensive option of Uloric. Case study number 4 focuses on Medicare D. Now, Medicare D, we worry about that donut hole. And coming in 2018, the donut hole actually changes again. The goal is by 2020, it's going to be completely closed. We'll still have to wait and see about that due to, what happens with healthcare over the next couple of years. Under Medicare Part D, starting in 2018, the patient will be responsible for just 35% of the cost of the drug when they hit the donut hole. However, if you look at this patient, and a good way to guess this is AWP, and AWP is what the average price of the drug is. A lot of times, as I told you in the talk, we get reimbursed based on a percentage discount off of AWP. But AWP a lot of times is one of the ways you can see whether or not they would hit the donut hole. But if you take into account this patient has a drug that's $146, a drug that's $235, a drug that's $137, and a drug that's $118, and you take 35% of each one of those, it's still going to be fairly expensive for a patient who's on a fixed income. So the example of this one is a 70-year-old patient has a new prescription for Vytorin. And we know Vytorin is also available generic, but Vytorin is not cheap either. And when you go to fill the prescription, you find the patient has a copay of $48. So they actually cover it, but this drug is in a higher tier. The thing is, the patient is afraid of going into the donut hole, and we have a diabetic patient. And patients that have diabetes, most of the time, if they're on any type of insulin or injectable therapy, it's going to be very easy for them to hit that donut hole sometime during that year. And so this patient, in this case scenario, one of the things we would ask them first in relationship with Vytorin is, have they been on just simvastatin alone before? We know that Zetia, which is the other drug that's in Vytorin, helps affect the absorption of cholesterol, but we would want to assess to see how this patient's diet is and how their cholesterol is doing and whether or not they would benefit from the Vytorin or they'd benefit from just staying on the simvastatin. Maybe we need to switch them to another statin as an option, such as atorvastatin or rovastatin. But once again, remember our prior case scenario of rovastatin and the cost. The other thing we may want to do is in the future sit down and talk to the patient of looking at their medications. Because if, in today's world of pay-for-performance contracts, one of the things that happen to us as pharmacists with contracts is if the patient can't afford their meds and they're non-compliant, especially with diabetes meds, that actually can have a negative impact on the reimbursement of our contracts. And so one of the things why we care about this is that most of the time we make more money filling generic prescriptions. And also, too, there's a lot of brands that don't have a lot of great efficacy. We know Lantus is probably out of the 3 medications that are listed here is probably the most important one, that basal insulins do lower the hemoglobin A1C anywhere from 1.5 to 2. Obviously, we want to know what this patient's hemoglobin A1C is to make sure they do warrant insulin. Januvia, which is a DPP-4, it only has the effect of about lowering the hemoglobin A1C about 0.5%. So if this is a drug we could really evaluate, does the patient still need it? Byetta, which is a GLP-1 agonist, which is similar to Januvia but is a little bit more potent because it's directly stimulating incretins. that Byetta has been associated helping with weight loss. And so this patient isn't really obese. Patient's been on Lantus. We may be able to talk to this patient about their diet and maybe remove these two medications. And in the long run, just to share with you from a business perspective, you're not always making a lot of money on brand medications. And so this is kind of a win-win to help you in terms of your inventory, in terms of your contracts, but at the same time helping your patient continue to be able to afford their medications and continue to be your patient at your pharmacy. And so this one is a more complex one, but this one focuses on understanding, the Medicare D law and the prescriptions. And when we meet in person or if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. The last one is kind of another interesting one too, is that, so this one comes in, this is another step therapy one. So that we have a 24-year-old male comes into the pharmacy with a prescription for a Z-Pak, phenergan with codeine, and Advair. And when you look at this looks like classically the patient has some type of bacterial lung infection. They probably have a chronic cough and cold symptoms, forgetting the promethazine with codeine. But the Advair is a questionable one. So the Advair rejects because it requires step therapy. And Advair is a combo drug. It has an inhaled corticosteroid, long-acting beta-2 agonist, which we see in asthma and COPD. But in the asthma guidelines, it's recommended that we try to inhale corticosteroid first. Then we go to Advair. So for example, if I had asthma and I get put on inhaled corticosteroid, but the physician initially writes Advair, I go to the pharmacy, it rejects. The pharmacist switches it to, say, Flovent. But after 30 days, I go back to my physician. I say, you know what, it's still not working for me. I'm taking it every day, but I still have nighttime symptoms. So the physician writes for Advair, says, hey, go back to the pharmacy, get that filled. When I take it into the pharmacy goes to fill it, and they look, and actually this time it goes through because it followed the step therapy. The questions that we need to ask this person is, do they truly have asthma or COPD, so that we can, probably in a 24-year-old, less likely COPD, but if they have asthma, we need to talk to them about have they ever been on inhaled corticosteroid as monotherapy. If this is just an inhaler to help with the symptoms of breathing because of the bacterial infection, this is not a good choice because this drug is going to take anywhere from 3 to 5 days for really to take effect, especially with a steroid. And maybe this patient would benefit from a prednisone taper, a Medrol dose pack, and maybe a Ventolin inhaler as a rescue inhaler to help with the breathing during maybe a bacterial bronchitis. So hopefully these 5 cases gave you a test of your knowledge and applicable of what you've learned from the third-party insurance lecture. But trust me, we can have numerous talks of this later on. My last thing that I want to relate with you guys is that I did post to you numerous readings and articles. I know there's a lot here, but one of the things, if you go into under the and I apologize, it doesn't look like my accounting and YouTube videos are showing, so I'll have to fix that. Okay, so I'll fix that for you. But when you go into that under accounting, YouTube, and podcasts, you will actually find some great videos from a CPA named Olin Sykes. Olin actually is a CPA that specializes in helping independent pharmacy, and Olin talks a lot about the different financial ratios, and so I will get that reposted and fixed to you. I'm sorry. Either it's my computer or there's something wrong with Blackboard, but I'll correct that. The other ones I gave you is there's a good chapter from a book called Financing for Pharmacists, and this is on explaining about financial statements and analysis. I encourage you to read. And then I gave you several different articles about understanding financial statements. Some are from the pharmacy perspective, some are from just understanding, because we're going to talk about knowing key ratios and how we can look at our finances in our business and analyze what we do from a management standpoint. Most of the time, you're still going to have a CPA doing this, but that's what these numerous articles kind of speak the same thing, but give you from a different aspect. The other thing that I want to share with you is NCPA every year through Cardinal publishes their digest, and their digest kind of gives you some bar markers of how the pharmacy business is, and if I was comparing my business to other pharmacies, how do I measure up? They do give a more in-depth digest, but actually the only people they reveal that in-depth digest to anymore is if you own a pharmacy and you actually share those numbers. And so the last time people that had assets for a 2013 was 2013. And so please read through those. And when we go through our evaluating a pharmacy, at our very last live lecture we do together, you'll actually be applying some of those principles. But I will have to you, there's no assignment due this week, but I will have for you a case scenario assignment in the coming weeks. Okay, hopefully that helped you. And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to contact me, and enjoy exploring the world of financials this week. And trust me, it takes time to learn it, but over time, you'll become an expert and it'll be like a second language to you. Thank you guys and have a good week.